The whole state, and now its highest court, have been abuzz about the MBTA Communities Law, which in simple terms requires 177 mostly eastern Massachusetts cities and towns near public transit to zone for a district of reasonable size where multifamily housing is allowed by right. But that simple premise has dredged up an age-old fight over local versus state power and who gets to make the rules about how Massachusetts tries to address a crippling housing crisis. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, Commonwealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. We're taking something of a trip down legislative memory lane today, but let's talk about where things stand at the moment first. So, in short versions, Attorney General Andrea Campbell is suing the town of Milton, which adopted a zoning plan through its town meeting that would have met the MBTA community standards, only for residents to then reject the plan by referendum. In a case now before the Supreme Judicial Court, the AG wants the court to conclude that Milton has to pass a compliant zoning plan and also declare that the AG's office is allowed to sue to enforce that law. Milton is arguing that the law laid out a few specific grants that could be drawn away for communities that don't get on board, and therefore lawmakers only ever intended those specific financial penalties rather than letting the AG force the town into zoning. Plus, Milton says the way that the State Housing Office handed down specific guidelines skipped a procedural step, and that should invalidate the whole lot of them. Okay, the basics are out of the way, let's get into the fun stuff. Today I'm joined by Senator Brendan Crighton of Lynn, who introduced that initial MBTA Communities Amendment that then became law in 2021, and Amy Dain, a zoning expert and consultant in the think tank space who wasn't involved in writing the law, but has contributed a tremendous amount of research as evidence for the need to retool the way the state zones. Senator Crighton, Amy, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Jennifer. Great to be here.
So we'll touch on a number of things that came up during the recent Supreme Judicial Court oral argument, but can I start by asking both of you what stood out in terms of what the justices seemed to be interested in? Amy, let's start with you.
So what I found interesting was what the case was not about. So the justices and the lawyers in the courtroom were not debating whether there's a housing crisis. They were not debating whether zoning has been a barrier to needed housing development. They weren't even debating whether it's appropriate or good policy for the state to take leadership on zoning policy. They weren't debating whether the state has authority to lead on zoning policy. It does. All of those things can be answered in the affirmative. They weren't even debating the merits of this specific law, and they weren't debating the contents of the implementation guidelines. So, as you mentioned, the case is really about some in-the-weeds procedural requirements, questions about what it means to be a guideline or a regulation and a requirement, and what the procedures are for establishing those, and looking at matters of authority of the AG and administration to enforce the law, but really rooted in the language of the specific law. So not as much in like a broader sense. It was really in the nitty-gritty of the wording and the case law.
And Senator Crighton, your name came up a few times during these arguments because, of course, you put forth the initial amendment. So what do you think, as a representative, as a senator, when suddenly the things that you said on the floor of the Senate chamber mid-pandemic in 2020 are being brought up as, well, did they mean for this to actually be enforceable by the AG?
Yeah, that probably stood out the most, having your name mentioned in court. Not always a great thing, but in this instance, I was proud to have that referenced. Certainly would have been a little more careful drafting my speech and been able to practice a few more times before giving it, had I known it was going to be such a big deal. But I mean, obviously the question around intent, I appreciate the Attorney General enforcing the law that we put in place, certainly the intent of the legislature at the time. And this bill had been around for quite some time, I should say, too, going back to when Governor Baker first introduced his Housing Choice Act in 2017, early 2018. So the concept, it's being pointed at as, limited evidence that there was a legislative process, when I feel like it was just the opposite. We had been talking about this for a long, long time. But certainly, when we pass a law, the intent is for it to be enforced. And historically, that's what the Attorney General has done. So I, again, am really supportive of this law. And to Amy's point earlier, I mean, the big picture here is about a housing crisis where families can no longer afford to live in Massachusetts. And as a former city councilor for 6 years, I tackled zoning. It's tremendously hard. I think we had to be bold. I think Governor Baker was bold then. I think the legislature, as well. And now we have a new administration that's really rolling up their sleeves and trying to make sure that we're tackling this crisis again. So it's been well vetted for a long time, but I think it's a healthy conversation to have, and appreciate you raising the issue.
The act itself was a pretty short piece of legislation that was in the middle of this big, broad economic development bill. So, Senator Crighton, again, I went back, I watched the actual introduction of this amendment massed on the floor of the Senate. So how did the idea of this kind of approach to transit-oriented development, by creating these requirements, but also leaving a lot of the specifics of it to be hashed out by the executive branch, actually sort of come across your desk or cross your mind? Why this approach?
Absolutely. So I have to give a shout out to my former colleague who was the housing chair at the time, Joe Boncory. He and his team, along with some really wonderful advocates, hashed out this idea when he was housing chair. Fast forward to the next session. Appreciate the Senate President, Karen Spilka, appointing me to chair the Housing Committee with Representative Chair Kevin Honan. And certainly the Senate President recognized there was a housing crisis and tasked us with coming up with bold approaches to tackle it. So we certainly were supportive of the governor's housing choice bill, which, for those folks that may not know, would, change the supermajority requirement for certain local zoning to a simple majority, which makes sense. Again, changing zoning is really hard. It's really hard to get a supermajority vote. And I think that's hindered some of our housing production over the decades. I have to give credit to the Governor Baker, Secretary Keneally. They really put a lot of effort into meeting with legislators, meeting with stakeholders across the Commonwealth, and really campaigned to push this forward. There were a few other proposals too that we tried to get in there. Some made it, some didn't. But a butter repeal reform, just making sure that neighbors of a project couldn't kill it for frivolous reasons. Inclusionary zoning by simple majority as well to encourage affordable housing. So we had a bill that I inherited from Senator Boncory. We were working that as a standalone bill. COVID hit, a number of other things. We had some other crises to deal with at the time, but oftentimes in the legislature we saw an opportunity with an economic development bill to really tackle the housing issue there. And at the time we had spent years talking to members, talking to advocates, talking to stakeholders across the state, so felt it was well vetted. And I applaud Governor Baker and Secretary Keneally for having a really robust public process over those next year or so to really implement the policy that we had created.
So, Amy, lawmakers, like the senator here, really hammered the scale of this crisis during discussion of the amendment. So I wonder if you can also take us back a little bit. What does the Massachusetts zoning universe look like that the MBTA Communities Act was trying to address from your side of things? What specific kind of thorny elements of the zoning process, and then also kind of where does it become a difficult question of political resistance?
Right. So I started working on this issue in 2004, 20 years ago. I was straight out of grad school. I had never thought of zoning as a controversial issue. It's just part of the natural order of things. Zoning laws exist. And I thought I was on this new, really interesting issue working on it, thinking about how zoning was causing a housing shortage in 2004, which was causing price escalations, and we really had a housing crisis. And I did this big study looking at how there are all these zoning barriers to housing development in 2004. So I'm like, this is really new. And then I found that there were all these housing activists getting started on the issue, 10 years ago, and they thought the issue was new. I went back and did some research on the history, and we have to remember that Chapter 40B that lets developers bypass local zoning to build mixed income developments was established in 1969 because in the 1960s, people understood that zoning was a barrier to needed housing development. And as I dug into it in the 1970s, there were all these state reports that zoning is preventing us from getting the housing we need, especially diverse housing, especially apartment buildings. 1980s, there were reports on this. So this is an incredibly old issue. And I've seen through all these years different approaches. Chapter 40B was one of the most effective approaches and has led to a lot more housing development than we would have seen, although it doesn't solve the whole issue. A lot of the efforts at the state level have gone into planning. So we've seen wave after wave of state funding for local planning for more housing. And starting in 2004, I was reading local community development plans, housing plans, and master plans, comprehensive plans that the state often helped pay for. And they would say things like, consider zoning for multifamily housing, but it wouldn't be followed up with actual zoning reform. And then I did another big study of zoning in 2019. I again read the plans. The state had funded housing production plans across so many communities. Again, it wasn't leading to changes in the zoning, all of that planning. Also back to 2004, when I was getting started on this, the state was recognizing there's a housing shortage, and they came up with an incentive program called 40R, where they said, we'll actually pay for permitting of more housing as an incentive, like municipality will get more funds from the state. That led to really minimal amount of housing, really minimal amount of rezoning. It didn't accomplish it. So there had been all these efforts in terms of like bypassing zoning, in terms of planning funds, in terms of incentives that just hadn't worked. And this is going on for decades. And finally, there was just this concept that the best way to do it, or a new way to do it, is for the state to mandate local zoning reform to allow for multifamily housing. There's a different approach where the state could do the zoning directly. It has the authority to do that, to allow things directly. But its approach of saying we are going to require cities and towns to do the rezoning, and that rezoning is still happening at the local level, enabling planning, enabling local input and local voice and decision making around it, is the model of the MBTA Communities zoning law. And that's what we've seen in implementation. It is epic. It applies to 177 cities and towns. That's 177 planning boards that are meeting about this. This is city councilors are discussing it. It's town meeting members need to get up to speed on zoning and how to deal with this. There are hearings held in 177 cities and towns, multiple meetings. It's really intense. It's this huge effort. And it's exciting to see, as somebody who's been studying zoning for 20 years and read so many plans, really exciting to see votes happening.
So, Senator, actually getting into that a little bit. So you were, if I recall correctly, you were a city councilor in Lynn in a previous life here. So how has your approach and kind of how did it end up impacting putting forth this amendment and taking this approach to thinking about state versus local control actually kind of math out in your head? This is often a very complicated question. There's often a lot of push and pull between state powers saying you must do this versus localities asking permission from the state to do other things. So where was that tension in your head as you were thinking about this as a mandate or a requirement or a suggestion?
Thank you. It's a great question. So I think back to my time with the city council, and obviously, when you have a level of power or control over an issue, it's difficult to give that up. And I think that's one reason for, close to 100 years, our zoning remained largely unchanged in the city of Lynn, a couple pockets here or there. But overall, it was created with the approach that you have to come before the council and you have to, really make many concessions, and, we have the ultimate power. So you had a whole messy arrangement around special permits, and it just wasn't working for the development we wanted. So I think we looked in the mirror and said, all right, what do we want to be as a city, as a gateway city, and where do we want to develop mixed use versus single family? And we had a long process. So I'll land the plane there on that, but it was a challenging and not without controversy trying to pass a more progressive zoning. So I certainly understand communities and their concerns around losing the character of their community. But I looked at it, again, we have a housing crisis. We believe that production is the way to lower costs for homeowners as well as renters. And transit-oriented development has been a proven way to do that throughout time, while also reducing traffic congestion, which obviously impacts our emissions, among many other things. So for me, if you're getting the benefit of being near public transit, a simple requirement that you allow for a zone of multifamily. And this is, we're not mandating that the buildings go up tomorrow, but rather just allowing for that one zone made sense. Some of the maps you look at for zoning across the state are remarkable. It's just like one color on there because they're, single family, largely single family only with really big lot sizes. And to think of that, near a train station or bus stop, or to have such restrictive zoning that you're keeping people out, you're keeping families out of your community. We thought that the state needed to step in, and we don't do so lightly. And there certainly were groups that opposed, but this crisis needed urgent action. And I also think that we couldn't wait around any longer for some of the communities to do the right thing.
And so getting to one of the questions that the SJC has really been digging into is the literal language of the amendment itself and kind of how it was discussed at the time in terms of, well, what if they say no? Justice Scott Kofker, during the arguments, noted that generally speaking, the state does not say that localities only have to follow state law if they feel like it. Generally speaking, the understanding is that if the state says you have to do this, you don't get to just say, I don't want to, though. But the question then comes, how do you enforce that? How do you encourage or how do you incentivize it? And some of the discussion has come around the fact that the actual amendment that made it through all the way into the final bill laid out a few specific grants that could be withdrawn or withheld or, wrenched back if a city or town didn't comply. But then the broader question is, was that intended to be the only option? Was the Attorney General allowed to do anything with that? House Ways and Means Chair Aaron Michalowicz just said yesterday that as far as he's concerned, there are supposed to be teeth to these regulations, that the Attorney General is supposed to be able to enforce it. But again, thinking back 4 years ago, was that a worry that occurred, that this might be something that the AG wouldn't be allowed to do?
No, it wasn't. I mean, I guess just in general, when we pass laws, we assume that, the Attorney General and their branch of government is going to enforce them. So, while we listed certain grants, in my mind at the time and now still, I mean, those were examples to highlight that, there are consequences, and there are certainly weren't meant that to be exclusive by no means. And the Attorney General has her role, and she's, I think, doing a wonderful job pursuing this and enforcing the law. But I agree with Chair Michalowicz. It certainly was our intent to allow her to have that enforcement.
Amy, thinking about the way that these guidelines ended up being rolled out, the law itself allows basically for the housing office to say, look, we say that these are the general rules for what the requirement is, but in practice, we want to build in flexibility. We want to build in the ability of the housing office to kind of be responsive to specific municipalities, figure out what the deadlines are, that sort of thing. So from your perspective, as you were watching these guidelines start to get promulgated, what was your concept of how the process was working, how you understood this to kind of be applying, and more specifically, what were they telling these communities that they had to do, or what? Like, what did this look like from an outside observer's perspective?
Right. So let's start with what the law said. The MBTA Communities Zoning Law requires that cities and towns zone for districts of reasonable size where multifamily housing will be allowed as of right near train stations if possible. And then the law instructs the executive branch, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, to create guidelines for implementation of that. And the first question that came to me after reading the law was like, what is a district of reasonable size? So I think that EOHLC did a great job coming up with guidelines on that. It was a very convincing case. They did their research, they held their hearings, they took input, they revised based on the input, and really came up with some really innovative and compelling ways to manage performance of zoning. Came up with a set of performance indicators to define reasonable size. And I think the problem was when people think of like, what's the size of a district? Is it 50 acres? Is it 20 acres? But then like, say you pick a number. And does it make sense that every community, whether you're Hopkinton or you're Cambridge, whether you're like a small town or like a major city, that they should all have the same requirement? Like that doesn't really make sense. So they came up with this sort of double standard as one of a minimum land area, but the other was this concept of zoning capacity. And the idea was to create zoning that allows for a certain amount of multifamily housing within the zoning district. And we'll call that like amount of housing zoning capacity. And then they set the zoning capacity targets for towns as a percent of the number of houses you have. And that kind of evens out the rate of development across communities. So if you have a lot of housing, you likely could accommodate a little bit more housing than those that don't have a lot of housing. And so it was really tailored that not all communities are the same. And they went a step further in defining zoning capacity. So they did a higher percent of units if you're served by rapid transit, a lower percent of units if you just have commuter rail but not rapid transit. And then there are communities that are adjacent to communities that have train stations, and those had an even lower percent of units that they needed. And then there were especially small communities that had a very low percent. So you have some places that only need to zone for 100 units, whereas some places need to zone for a capacity of 10,000 units. A huge variation. It was very tailored, a really thoughtful approach. So you had these multi-layered performance measures. And then the thing that I was worried about as somebody who reads zoning and understands the really tough local politics is if you set standards too high, is it even going to be possible for cities and towns to meet the standards? Where do you set those? And it's been pretty compelling that we already have close to 80 communities that have revised their zoning to meet the performance standards, which is a sign that the state nailed it, that they really came up with standards that were implementable, that were a little challenging.
So one thing that occurs to me as Amy very competently lays out sort of these details and as they're being applied to all of these local municipalities is that is a lot of detail. And this was an amendment inside a really big economic development bill. And of course, these economic development bills kind of involve these late night hash outs through conference committee, see what actually makes it out the other side. Of course, this amendment started in the Senate, wasn't in the House version, did make it through to the final version. But I guess my question, or sort of what's striking me here, is that's so much detail. It would have been very, very difficult, even if the legislature had an appetite to do it, to kind of include in an act passed through this sort of process. So, Senator, I wonder, kind of looking back on it, how do you feel about both the sort of placement of this amendment in this sort of big bill? It was a continuation of other policies, but it also introduced a pretty big new one. And then sort of where the best place for that detail to actually be hashed out was. Was the idea always the legislature is not really the people that should be figuring out what these sort of very detailed little guidelines are?
It's being looked at now as if, this kind of came out of nowhere. But again, the bill had been around for a couple sessions, had had hearings, had been, talked about in the public sphere for quite some time. We had countless meetings on this. The placement of it in an Act Dev bill was just, an opportunity, and housing policy and funding, occasionally occurs in that. So it's not unusual for a policy like this to not be a standalone bill. And I also think it's fairly common for us when you're dealing with such detailed issues that Amy just articulated very well, that we wouldn't include that all in the actual bill language, but rather have an agency or a secretary come forth and kind of lay out exactly how it's going to work on the ground level. I think it's important to note, too, that this wasn't just looking to force communities and say, go figure it out on your own, right? The administration, both administrations spent $7 million on technical assistance. And more recently, we were in Somerville the other day celebrating, it was 75 at the time. It sounds like it's closer to 80 that are in compliance. But this administration, the Haley Driscoll administration, has created the MBTA Communities Catalyst Fund. So that's $15 million over the next 3 years. Typical grant request will be between $250,000 and $1 million. So we want to give communities both the tools to create these policies, but then also help them in their efforts when it comes to housing production.
I think that's the sort of last note that I wanted to hit here, which is that you always have a difficulty from the administration side and, from a pitching a public policy perspective, where there is the desire to say, well, what is the outlier situation and what is the majority? So a lot of these discussions around the reception to and the action taken because of the MBTA Communities Act has basically been, well, most of them are in fact cooperating. Most of them are moving through the process to rezone and comply. But then the AG acknowledges that there is some fear about essentially a domino effect if this case ends up going in another direction. So I think I'd like to end starting with Amy and then going over to the senator. What have you learned about the reception to the Communities Act? What are you watching as the SJC deliberates, and even how Milton is starting to plan for one or the other outcome? Like, what's next for you and what have you learned so far?
I've never seen anything like this in the 20 years I've been working on zoning, to have vote after vote to reform local zoning to allow for multifamily housing as of right. So it's amazing. There have been close to 80 votes already. We have another 50 maybe scheduled for this fall. There's a huge pro-housing advocacy movement that's been growing. Public opinion on housing and zoning reform has been changing. The Mass Inc. polling group did that survey of 800 likely voters. 50% said MBTA Communities zoning law is good policy. 31% said bad policy. So there's a lot of public support. And it's just really exciting time to be in zoning policy, to see people doing the work to pick the districts to allow multifamily housing. That there are so many people who finally understand that we really need to zone for diverse types of housing for diverse people across the region. And that's good for people who need housing, because housing is a fundamental human need, but it's also good for social mobility, for the resilience of society. It's even good for the cities and towns of Greater Boston to have diverse housing, and helps the economic development, helps with the vitality of main streets. So housing is a wonderful thing. And I think that a lot of people are coming around to that perspective and starting to get involved in reform, whatever the outcome of the case is.
And if I could tweak the question very slightly for you, Senator, because one of the possibilities is that either the legislature or the housing office might have to take another crack at this. It's possible that the SJC comes out on that side of things. So how's this sort of process and the rollout and the reception look to you so far? And is there any thought, given that you're aware of at least, that if needed, there might be room for some tweaks?
We're not really considering any tweaks. We believe in the law and as it was intended to be enforced. The focus is really on making sure that communities have the resources they need, making sure that the public is educated on this. Zoning is really complicated, even for the best, smartest experts in the room, right? So trying to let people know what it actually is. I get asked about this quite a bit, and occasionally pretty strongly criticized by friends, family, neighbors, constituents, and oftentimes it's before they've even seen the plan, or the plan doesn't even exist yet. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. And I think the Baker administration, as well as the Haley administration, have gone to great lengths to give communities, again, the tools to make this happen, but also the flexibility to still preserve the character in their town while being able to comply with this. And this is just one tool in the toolbox, really. This is not going to solve our housing crisis. We're not going to create 200,000 units by 2030 with this alone. So in the legislature, we continue to make investments. The big housing bond bill, $5.16 billion in authorizations this past year. A tremendous amount of rental assistance and other programs that are at record levels of funding. So we continue to look at this. I started in the legislature 19 years ago as a staffer, and you were dealing with crises then, and you would usually tackle a big issue, and then it would be kind of on the shelf for another 4 or 5 years and come back and we'll do another big, transportation bill or healthcare bill. With housing, and I think kind of the approach now is that this isn't a one session thing and we'll come back in a decade. This is every session. How do we build? How do we pick up pieces that may not have crossed the finish line? It's such a crucial issue for all sectors of our economy and just the quality of life here in Massachusetts, as unfortunately we see many younger folks and others leaving the state because of housing. The polling was mentioned earlier as well. This is, I think, the top issue on people's minds, at least when I'm in the district talking to folks, is how can I afford to live and stay in Massachusetts?
Thanks again to Senator Crichton and Amy Dain for joining me on the Codcast. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is Claire Wigglesworth. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We will be back next week.